Dr. Richard Clayton stood at the gate with a quiet determination that belied the storm raging in his heart. It was a chilly morning at Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, and as he clutched his first-class boarding passes alongside his beloved wife Diana and their bright-eyed son Marcus, an unsettling tension hung in the air like a gathering storm over the runway. The silence in Terminal C was more than just the absence of noise. It was the weight of unspoken prejudice, the kind that had haunted his every step for decades. When the gate agent, Marjorie, a woman with rigid blonde hair and a smile that once seemed inviting but now had turned cold and calculating, stepped forward, the air itself felt charged with anticipation. The entire terminal seemed to pause, and all eyes were drawn to the slender phone in Dr. Clayton's hand. A phone that had become an almost mystical talisman in that moment. His family, the only black family in the first-class line, was about to face yet another injustice that history had dealt too often. Marjorie's face, once flushed with authority and certainty, drained to an ashen gray. Her hand trembled as she reached for the counter's edge, her eyes narrowing in a way that sent a chill down Richard's spine. "Just one moment, please," she said, her voice laced with a tone that hinted at something far more sinister than a simple computer error. Richard's heart pounded as memories of past indignities surged through him. He recalled earlier that day when, at home in their stately Tudor in a leafy Atlanta suburb, the family had shared moments of joy and anticipation. Diana, ever elegant and fierce despite her grueling 70-hour work weeks as a corporate attorney, had flashed a warm smile as she handed him his favorite blue tie, a tie that had carried him through countless presentations and research breakthroughs in neurology. Today, however, that cherished symbol of his success was at the center of a confrontation that threatened to shatter their hope for a pleasant journey. Marjorie's eyes flicked between the boarding passes and the family. "There appears to be an irregularity with your reservation," she stated flatly, her tone rising just a notch, as if daring him to challenge her authority. "Our system shows that you are booked in economy, rows 32A, B, and C." The implication was clear and cruel, that first class was a privilege reserved for some, not for a family like his. Deanna's eyes flashed with indignation as she calmly replied, "My husband booked and paid for first class, and our boarding passes clearly reflect that." But her measured words did little to cool the rising tension. For a moment, the terminal was divided. On one side, passengers in crisp business suits and retirees in expensive attire looked on with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. On the other, Richard and his family stood as living testaments to the injustice of a system that seemed to favor one race over another. The injustice stung sharply, but more than that, it ignited a resolve in Richard that he had long suppressed for the sake of peace and dignity. As Marjorie continued to tap at her keyboard with exaggerated deliberation, the air thickened with the unspoken acknowledgement of a history marred by racial discrimination. Every beep from her machine, every pause between her words, echoed with the legacy of countless families who had been unjustly sidelined. The once buzzing terminal now felt like a stage where a tragic drama was unfolding, one that would test the very limits of Richard's patience and determination. With every passing second, the injustice grew more intolerable, and so did Richard's resolve to reclaim his dignity. Then, as if the universe had been waiting for this moment of reckoning, a silver-haired man in a Brooks Brothers suit cleared his throat, his presence a silent nod to the unspoken alliances that sometimes formed in such tense moments. His interjection only served to deepen the divide between those in power and those who were constantly marginalized. Richard's pulse raced as he realized that this was not just about a simple booking error. It was a calculated act of discrimination, a reminder of the times when his achievements were overshadowed by the color of his skin. In that instant, as Marjorie's feigned concern turned to a subtle yet unmistakable sneer, Richard made a silent vow. The injustice would not be tolerated, and the humiliation would not be his final chapter. In his mind, he began to piece together a plan. not just to secure his rightful place in first class, but to deliver a response so resounding that it would force the entire system to reckon with its own biases. This was not merely a personal battle. It was a fight for justice that had been waged for generations. And today, Richard would ensure that the scales of retribution tipped decisively in favor of the oppressed. With each carefully measured breath, Richard's voice grew firmer as he addressed Marjorie. "I understand that your system is showing an error, but these boarding passes are as legitimate as the research that has made my career. We have the confirmation emails right here," he said, reaching for his phone with the steady hands of a man who had weathered countless storms. His words, laced with both calm authority and simmering fury, resonated through the terminal. It was a call for accountability, a demand that the oppressive forces of discrimination be met with unyielding resistance. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Marjorie, whose facade of calm authority was crumbling under the weight of her own prejudices, found herself trapped between the rigid structures of an inflexible system and the undeniable truth of Richard's evidence. The silver-haired gentleman's gaze hardened as he watched the interaction, a silent witness to the slow-burning rebellion against systemic injustice. Diana, whose keen legal mind had already begun dissecting the implications of every word exchanged, felt a surge of protective anger that mingled with deep sorrow for the injustice inflicted upon her family. Marcus, initially oblivious, now stared wide-eyed at the unfolding drama, his youthful face etched with a dawning awareness of the cruel realities of the world. And then, just as the tension seemed poised to reach its breaking point, Richard's calm resolve transformed into a declaration of retribution that would be remembered for years to come. "If you continue to treat us as less than what we are, you leave me no choice but to take this matter higher. I will expose every ounce of prejudice hidden within this institution, and when I do, you and everyone complicit in this injustice will face consequences that are both swift and public," he announced, his voice carrying an edge of finality that sent shivers down the spines of those who listened. His words were not a mere promise. They were a battle cry, a vow to reclaim dignity from the jaws of discrimination. Marjorie's face contorted into a mask of barely concealed fury, and the silence in the terminal shifted from tense expectation to a palpable sense of impending reckoning. The atmosphere crackled with the electricity of retribution, a retribution that was not violent in its execution, but powerful in its declaration of moral and social justice. As the first-class passengers, many of whom had never before witnessed such a public confrontation, watched in stunned silence, they felt a stirring of empathy and righteous indignation. Here was a man who had spent his life overcoming obstacles only to be thwarted by the bitter sting of racial bias, and yet he stood poised to transform his suffering into a triumph that would resonate far beyond the confines of that sterile terminal. The airport, usually a realm of transient connections and mundane delays, had become the stage for a dramatic redefinition of respect and equality. The family's plight, steeped in the legacy of hardship and exclusion, now found a powerful echo in the resolve of Dr. Richard Clayton, a man determined to ensure that his family, and every family like theirs, would never again be relegated to the margins. In that moment, the confrontation was no longer just about a mistaken booking. It was about reclaiming a voice that had long been silenced by systemic cruelty. For the women who had weathered decades of life's ups and downs, for those who understood the bittersweet taste of resilience, Richard's declaration was a call to stand up against every slight, every act of discrimination that had been inflicted over the years. It was a testament to the indomitable human spirit, a story of triumph born from the depths of despair. And as the terminal bore witness to that transformation, it became clear that sometimes the most profound acts of retribution are not those that rely on brute force, but those that restore dignity and demand justice in the face of overwhelming odds. In the days that followed, the story of Dr. Richard Clayton and his family would spread far and wide, stirring conversations in living rooms, community centers, and even in the halls of power. It was a story that made people especially those wise and experienced women who had seen enough of life's trials, pause and reflect on the importance of standing up for what is right. The injustice they had witnessed was not just a personal affront, but a challenge to the very ideals of fairness and respect that formed the bedrock of American society. The confrontation at Hartsfield-Jackson was only the beginning of a larger movement. Richard Clayton's resolute stance became a beacon for all who had suffered in silence, and his promise of retribution, of a public reckoning with those who wielded power unjustly, resonated deeply with anyone who believed that true progress could only be achieved when the voices of the marginalized were heard, loud and clear. In that defining moment, the airport was transformed from a place of routine transit into a crucible of change. A place where the seeds of revolution were sown in the fertile soil of long-suppressed anger and the unyielding quest for justice. And so, as the boarding process resumed amidst a hush of uncertainty and anticipation, Dr. Richard Clayton's family, emboldened by their shared resolve, stepped forward into a future that promised not only retribution, but also a new dawn of respect, equality, and recognition. Their story, marked by struggle and stained by injustice, would soon become an inspiring saga of courage and triumph. A narrative that would leave even the most seasoned and empathetic listeners saying, with a mix of awe and heartfelt approval, "Now that's what I call standing up for yourself." Dr. Benjamin Caldwell stood firm at the gate, his heart pounding as he held up his boarding passes and the undeniable evidence of his purchase, a credit card statement that clearly indicated a first-class fare. The tension in Terminal C had mounted to a fever pitch. Around him, several passengers had paused their conversations to watch the unfolding drama with a mix of discomfort and detached interest, as if they were witnessing a scandalous scene on a primetime television show. The gate agent, still struggling to maintain her false calm, repeated in an exaggerated tone, "Sir, boarding passes can sometimes reflect requested seating rather than confirmed seating. Our system is the final authority, and it shows your family in economy." Her voice dripped with an undercurrent of prejudice that sent a chill down Benjamin's spine. Diana, his wife of many years and a respected corporate attorney known for her measured yet formidable presence, interjected sharply, "Now, if you'll please step aside. I am not moving until you explain exactly what irregularities you see in our reservation." Her tone, firm and precise, left no room for negotiation. She stood as a pillar of dignity amid a sea of unspoken bias. The carefully maintained composure on her face hid the deep pain of repeated injustices, and her words cut through the stifling air like a clarion call for justice. Benjamin's young son, Marcus, at 17, watched the exchange with a mixture of anxiety and a budding awareness of the systemic inequities that had haunted his family for far too long. As the confrontation drew the attention of more onlookers, the silver-haired man in the Brooks Brothers suit stepped forward, adding to the pressure. "Excuse me, but some of us have confirmed first-class seats and would like to board," he said, his tone a blend of entitlement and impatience. Benjamin met his gaze with calm determination as he replied, "Sir, we also have confirmed first-class seats. We are simply asking the gate agent to honor them." The man's lips thinned slightly, but even his objection faltered in the face of Benjamin's unwavering conviction. At that moment, Keith, the gate agent's supervisor, approached with a practiced neutrality that did little to mask the tension. His name tag identified him as Keith, and he asked in a low, professional tone, "Is there an issue here, Marjorie?" Marjorie, who had tried to hide her discomfort behind a veneer of authority, explained, "These passengers have first-class boarding passes, but our system shows them in economy. I believe there may have been a computer error when their passes were issued." Keith turned to Benjamin and Diana with a smile that failed to reach his eyes as he said, "Let me take a look at your boarding passes, please." Benjamin handed them over silently, his gaze never leaving Keith's face. As Keith examined the documents and then turned his attention to the computer terminal, the atmosphere grew even more charged. After a few tense moments, Keith looked up and stated carefully, There appears to be a discrepancy between your boarding passes and our seating chart. Unfortunately, our first-class cabin is completely booked for this flight. We can accommodate you in our Comfort Plus section as a courtesy, but I'm afraid first class won't be possible today." Deanna's eyebrow arched dangerously at the suggestion of a mere courtesy, and she retorted, "A courtesy? We paid full fare for first class. This isn't about courtesy. It is about honoring a contractual agreement." The air in the terminal was thick with the weight of injustice. Passengers around them fell silent, their eyes flicking between Benjamin's resolute expression and the gate agent's faltering justification. It was then that Marcus, his voice trembling with both anger and a deep sense of righteousness, spoke up. "That's not how airline booking systems work. If the tickets were confirmed as first class, that means the inventory was available and allocated to us at the time of purchase." His words, though spoken with the uncertain timbre of youth, carried a precision that left Keith momentarily stunned. Keith blinked and hesitated, as Marcus's informed challenge cut through the haze of excuses. Diana's voice, firm and uncompromising, filled the silence that followed. "Young man, I've been in the courtroom and in corporate negotiations for years. I would like to speak with the gate manager. I am not asking, I demand that our confirmed first-class tickets be honored." Keith's jaw tightened ever so slightly as he replied, "Ma'am, I am the senior agent on duty. I have explained the situation and I am offering you Comfort Plus seating as a courtesy." His words, however, only fanned the flames of Benjamin's growing indignation. Before the tension could escalate further, an unexpected voice broke through the charged atmosphere. An elderly woman who had been quietly observing the unfolding dispute from a nearby seat rose slowly with the assistance of a cane. Her presence was commanding yet gentle, and she spoke in a warm yet resolute tone. "Excuse me. I couldn't help but overhear your predicament, and I think I might understand what's happening." All eyes turned to her as she approached the desk with measured steps. Her silver hair was styled in a neat bob, and she wore an impeccably tailored vintage Chanel suit with a pearl necklace that spoke of refined tradition. Keith, now visibly unsettled, addressed her with a note of deference. "Mrs. Winchester, how can I help you today?" The woman, introducing herself as Mrs. Margaret Winchester, replied with a soft southern drawl that belied the steel in her words. "Keith, I've been flying this airline for over 50 years. Longer than you have been alive, I might add. In all my years, I have seen many misunderstandings at gates like this one, and let me tell you, this particular incident bears an uncanny resemblance to those prejudice errors we used to witness back in the 1960s. Her words were gentle but carried an unyielding truth that resonated with every listener in the terminal. Mrs. Winchester continued, her voice growing even more persuasive as she addressed Keith directly. "From where I stand, it appears that a well-dressed black family has presented first-class boarding passes, only to be told there's some mysterious irregularity that necessitates moving you all to the back of the plane. In my day, we called that out for what it was, a blatant case of discrimination." The terminal fell into a heavy silence as her words sank in. Keith's face turned a deeper shade of red as he struggled to muster a response. Unable to ignore the mounting evidence and the palpable truth in Mrs. Winchester's words, Keith reluctantly turned back to the computer terminal, his fingers tapping on the keys with more force than necessary. After several tense moments that seemed to stretch on forever, his expression softened ever so slightly. It seemed Diana maintained her professional composure, though Benjamin could read the vindication in her eyes. With a nod of reluctant acceptance, Keith handed the boarding passes back to Benjamin, apologizing with a stiff formality. "Of course, we apologize for the confusion. You are cleared to board." As Benjamin, Diana, and Marcus began their journey down the jet bridge, the oppressive weight of the injustice that had threatened to crush them was momentarily lifted. Mrs. Winchester, now walking alongside them with a gentle tap of her cane on the floor, introduced herself fully as Margaret Winchester. "I must say, the patience and dignity you all showed today were remarkable," she said quietly. Benjamin extended his hand in gratitude. "Thank you for your intervention. It is a shame that in this day and age we still have to fight for what is right." Margaret's eyes sparkled with a mix of sorrow and determination as she replied, "I have spent too many years witnessing injustice and staying silent. At my age, speaking up is the least I can do." Marcus listened intently, admiration and hope mingling in his youthful gaze as he absorbed the lesson of standing up against discrimination. As they approached the aircraft door, a flight attendant greeted them with a warm smile and directed them to first class. The relief that washed over Benjamin was immense, but beneath it lay a simmering resolve. This was not merely a personal victory, it was a triumph over a system that had long marginalized families like his. The encounter had exposed the ugly underbelly of a flawed system and set the stage for a reckoning. Once on board, Benjamin and his family found themselves in a sanctuary of respect and dignity, a stark contrast to the cold indifference they had faced moments before. The experience left an indelible mark on them, reinforcing their determination to challenge the status quo. They knew that the battle against prejudice was far from over, and that their voice, their courage, and their unwavering pursuit of justice would be needed in the days to come. In the quiet aftermath of the confrontation, as the aircraft soared into the sky, Benjamin felt a renewed sense of purpose. The injustice they had endured was no longer a source of bitter defeat, but a catalyst for change. His mind raced with plans to publicly expose the discriminatory practices of the airline, to rally others who had suffered similar indignities, and to demand accountability from those in power. The story of his family's struggle would soon echo through boardrooms, living rooms, and community centers across the nation, a call to action for every person who had ever felt marginalized or diminished. For the seasoned women who had weathered decades of hardship and still clung to hope, this narrative was a reminder that even in the face of entrenched discrimination, dignity and resolve could light the way to a brighter future. Benjamin's resolve to turn this bitter experience into a resounding declaration of justice was both inspiring and humbling. In that moment, every passenger, every bystander, and every listener was compelled to acknowledge that the fight for equality was not just a battle fought by a few, but a collective struggle that defined the very soul of America. Dr. Malcolm Everett finally sank into his first-class seat, the memory of the humiliating gate incident still fresh in his mind as he helped Margaret store her small bag in the overhead compartment. Across the aisle, his wife Diana sat with quiet resolve while their son Marcus, still wide-eyed despite his earlier drowsiness, clutched his headphones like a shield. As the cabin filled with other first-class passengers, Malcolm's thoughts raced. He noticed the silver-haired man from the gate, whose eyes had been cold and unreadable earlier, now seated several rows behind him, his gaze following every movement as if silently condemning the events that had transpired. The gentle clink of glass from the pre-departure beverage service and soft murmur of hushed conversations created a deceptive calm, one that belied the tension still simmering beneath the surface. Diana leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper that only Malcolm could catch. "I still have all the receipts and email confirmations," she murmured with determined resolve. "This isn't over." Malcolm reached for her hand and squeezed it gently, drawing strength from her unwavering support. "I know, but let's get through the conference first," he replied, though his voice carried the underlying promise of a reckoning yet to come. Diana's reply was firm. "Of course, but afterwards I'm drafting a formal complaint." Their shared conviction was palpable, the unspoken vow that the injustice at the gate would not fade into obscurity but would instead fuel a campaign against the cruelty of an institution that had long taken advantage of people like them. Margaret, still standing as a dignified pillar in the aisle, leaned across with a twinkle of mischief in her eyes and a deliberate loudness that challenged any lingering assumptions among the fellow passengers. "First time in first class, dears?" she asked, her tone both playful and pointed. Diana smiled in recognition of the challenge, and Malcolm, ever the scholar, casually mentioned his keynote presentation on neurological research, scheduled for San Francisco that weekend. "My work on neuroplasticity and degenerative conditions isn't just about science," he said. "It's about breaking down barriers, much like what we experience today." Margaret's eyes sparkled as she recalled her late husband, a renowned neurosurgeon whose wisdom still guided her. "I've always found the brain to be the most elegant mystery in creation," she said softly, her words a reminder of the delicate balance between intellect and emotion. As Malcolm engaged in conversation with Margaret, the atmosphere in the cabin subtly shifted. Passengers who moments ago had harbored prejudiced assumptions about him being merely a black man in first class now began to reassess their opinions as they listened to the articulate, dignified tone of a doctor whose work had global implications. It was the familiar dance of bias being challenged by evidence, a reordering of priorities that went unspoken, yet was understood by every listener. A flight attendant soon appeared with a tray of drinks, offering champagne before takeoff, and Diana accepted her flute with a gracious nod and a whispered, "Thank you." Before long, Margaret leaned forward again, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, I always say that living well is the best revenge, but a well-documented complaint and a strongly worded letter to the company president can be just as satisfying," she confided, withdrawing a small leather-bound notebook from her purse. "I've been tracking computer errors on this airline for the past 3 years. Believe it or not, these errors happen to passengers of color roughly 8 times more frequently than to white passengers, especially in premium cabins." Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief, and Margaret smiled serenely as she added, "Young man, I was a statistics professor at Emory for 40 years before I retired. Data is my love language." Malcolm couldn't help but laugh in surprised delight at the unexpected depth of their new ally, realizing that appearances could be deceiving. This elegant, elderly white woman in her pearls and Chanel suit was far more formidable than anyone had presumed. As the captain's voice came over the intercom announcing imminent departure, Malcolm felt that familiar surge of anticipation that always accompanied the start of a journey, even as he battled the lingering sting of prejudice. Diana had already donned her noise-canceling headphones and opened her tablet to review case notes, her focus as sharp as ever. Across the aisle, Marcus and Margaret engaged in an animated conversation, their faces alight with the promise of change. Malcolm allowed himself a moment of gratitude for this unexpected ally and the tiny victory they had achieved at the gate, a victory that was both personal and emblematic of a larger struggle. Yet as the plane accelerated down the runway and soared into the clear blue sky, Malcolm could not shake the awareness that for every Margaret Winchester who stepped forward, there were countless others whose suffering went unchallenged. Every unacknowledged computer error, every silent degradation, was a wound that would eventually demand healing. Settling back into his seat, Malcolm opened his laptop, determined to review his slides one final time. His research on early-onset Alzheimer's represented a breakthrough that could change lives, and he refused to let the bitterness of discrimination derail his mission. The flight, lasting just over 5 hours, became a cocoon where the seeds of retribution and accountability were sown. 2 hours into the flight, as the service carts were cleared and passengers retreated into their own pockets of introspection or work, Malcolm found himself drawn into another conversation with Margaret. "Your son tells me you're presenting on neuroplasticity and degenerative conditions," Margaret remarked as she sipped her tea, her voice warm and admiring. "He's quite proud of you, you know," she added, her eyes reflecting genuine admiration. Malcolm glanced at Marcus, who was sound asleep with his headphones still delivering soft music, and felt a surge of affection and sorrow all at once, a bittersweet reminder that every battle fought for dignity had a cost. Margaret's tone then shifted, becoming more intimate and introspective. "May I ask you something rather personal, Dr. Everett?" she inquired gently, and Malcolm nodded, inviting her to continue. "How do you balance the constant vigilance, the need to be prepared for incidents like what happened at the gate, with the weight of work as important as yours?" Her question, direct and unflinching, caught him off guard. Malcolm paused, gathering his thoughts. "It's complicated," he finally said. Some days it feels like background noise, always present but ignorable. Other days it's front and center, impossible to escape. The key is not to let it define you entirely. Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes full of empathy. I imagine it takes tremendous mental compartmentalization, she said softly. Malcolm agreed, adding, it also means accepting that these compartments inevitably leak into one another. The frustration from that gate incident colors my mood, no matter how much I try to keep it separate from my work. Their conversation, rich with shared pain and resilience, wove together the personal and the political, highlighting the constant calculus of confrontation that defined their daily lives. Margaret then shared a poignant memory. My late husband's closest colleague, a brilliant black neurosurgeon named William Ross, used to say he only had so many confrontation tokens to spend each day, she recalled, her voice tinged with nostalgia. He believed that every time you speak up, you spend tokens not just for yourself, but for your whole family. Malcolm smiled in recognition of the metaphor, feeling the weight of generations of struggle and sacrifice. That's exactly it, he said, and sometimes those tokens are our only currency in a system that undervalues us. Diana, now engaged in a discussion with a flight attendant named Sophia about documenting the gate incident, interjected with wry humor, "Are we discussing the token economy of racism?" Her eyes, serious yet laced with humor, conveyed the long journey of battling an oppressive system. As their conversation continued, Deanna's tone grew firmer. "We need accountability," she declared. "Marjorie and Keith must understand that their actions have consequences. This isn't just an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, and it needs to be exposed." Across the aisle, Margaret dozed peacefully, her head resting lightly against the plush seat. Yet even in sleep, her presence was a reminder of the power of the past and the promise of change. Malcolm studied his wife's determined expression, the quiet strength in her eyes that had carried them through countless battles. The conversation shifted to their shared experiences navigating predominantly white institutions, a dialogue filled with both sorrow and fierce hope. They spoke of the long hours in courtrooms, the silent suffering at the hands of systemic bias, and the many moments when dignity was the only currency left to barter. A brief interruption came as Malcolm passed a silver-haired man in the narrow aisle, a man who had been at the gate earlier. He offered a curt nod and mumbled, "That was badly handled. At the gate it shouldn't have happened." Malcolm paused, surprised by the unexpected comment, and murmured, "No, it shouldn't have." The man's words, though few, hinted at a crack in the polite facade that many wore, an acknowledgement of the wrong that had been done. When Malcolm returned to his seat, Diana was speaking with Sophia, who assured her that the purser was documenting the incident. "On behalf of the airline, I apologize for your experience at the gate," Sophia said, her tone professional yet lacking true contrition. Diana's eyes met Malcolm's, and he felt a surge of resolve. "Good," he said quietly. "But I'm still not sure if we're aiming for just an apology, compensation, or full accountability." Diana's expression hardened, her voice firm as she declared, "They need to understand that these isolated incidents form a pattern. If a 70-something statistics professor can keep track of discriminatory practices as a hobby, imagine what a corporate legal team could uncover with proper motivation." As the flight continued its steady course, Malcolm allowed his mind to drift back to the conference ahead. His groundbreaking research on early-onset Alzheimer's was too important to let the sting of prejudice hold him back. Yet the memory of the gate incident, the cruelty of Marjorie and Keith, and the silent complicity of others lingered like a shadow he vowed to chase away. In that moment, Dr. Malcolm Everett realized that every injustice he endured was a call to arms, a rallying cry to not only secure his rightful place in the world, but to dismantle the barriers that had long kept people like him down. For every token spent, every small act of resistance, there would come a day when the full weight of retribution would be unleashed. A response so grand and unmistakable that it would leave the world exclaiming in awe, "Now that's what I call justice." Dr. Clarence Holloway sat back in his plush first-class seat, still feeling the sting of the morning's injustice, but determined not to let it dim the spark of his brilliance. Beside him, his wife Diana, a formidable corporate attorney with a heart as gentle as it was strong, squeezed his hand reassuringly. Their son, Marcus, barely awake yet wise beyond his years, looked on with a mix of admiration and solemnity. They had just endured an ordeal at the gate that reeked of racial discrimination, a blatant reminder that even in a world of technological marvels, some ancient cruelties still festered. Now, as they soared above the Pacific with San Francisco's glimmering bay in the distance, the family sought refuge in the promise of a brighter future, though the bitter taste of injustice lingered like an unwelcome guest. Deanna whispered to Clarence, "I still have all the receipts and email confirmations, and this isn't over." Her voice, soft yet steely, carried the weight of a promise to fight back. Clarence responded with a gentle squeeze of her hand and a quiet determination. "I know, but let's get through the conference first. My presentation is critical. It's not just about me. It's about every life we can touch with our research." Diana, ever the warrior, added, "Of course, but once we're done, I'm drafting a formal complaint that will leave no room for excuses." The resolve in her words was palpable, a vow to expose the hypocrisy of an airline that treated a confirmed first-class booking as nothing more than a clerical error, a pretext to deny a black family what they rightfully earned. Margaret Winchester, the silver-haired, elegant elderly lady who had come to their aid at the gate, now stood in the aisle with a twinkle of mischief and wisdom in her eyes. "First time in first class, dears?" she had teased earlier, and her words had reverberated like a rallying cry against injustice. Now, as the cabin filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clink of champagne glasses, Margaret leaned forward once more. "Living well is the best revenge," she confided conspiratorially, her voice dropping low enough for only those closest to her to hear. "But don't underestimate the power of a strongly worded letter. I have documented these computer errors for 3 years. Believe it or not, passengers of color face these issues 8 times more often in premium cabins than their white counterparts." Marcus's eyes widened in astonishment at the precision of her observations, and Margaret added, "Data, my dears, is the language of truth. I was a statistics professor at Emory for 40 years, and I can tell you, the numbers don't lie." Clarence couldn't help but chuckle softly. This elegant, refined ally was every bit as formidable as she appeared, her pearls and Chanel suit belying a fire that refused to be quenched. As the plane began its descent over the glittering San Francisco Bay, with iconic bridges emerging through the soft fog, Clarence allowed himself a brief moment of hope. The promise of his keynote presentation on groundbreaking neurological research, a culmination of 5 years of relentless work, filled him with anticipation. Yet even as he focused on his slides, his mind remained tethered to the bitter memory of the gate incident, a stark reminder of the work still needed to uproot systemic discrimination. Once the aircraft taxied to the gate and the seatbelt sign finally dinged off, the family gathered their belongings. Clarence helped Margaret retrieve her small suitcase from the overhead bin, and she offered a gentle, "Thank you, dear," while adjusting her grip on her cane. Diana inquired about Margaret's travel plans, and with genuine warmth, Margaret revealed that her son lived in Pacific Heights and that she would be meeting him at baggage claim. She even slipped a small embossed card into Diana's hand, inviting them to dinner at her home, a gesture of kindness meant to remind them that solidarity could be found even in the most unexpected places. Their path led them through the bustling terminal of San Francisco International Airport, where the chaos of arrivals and departures underscored the fragile balance between order and disarray. As they made their way toward the baggage claim, a sudden shift in Deanna's expression caught Clarence's attention. Her phone had chimed with an incoming email, and when she read it, her eyes darkened with controlled anger. It was from Delta Airlines customer service, and the subject line read, "Regarding your experience this morning." With measured calm, Diana showed the message to Clarence. The email apologized for a misunderstanding during the boarding process and offered a paltry 5,000 sky miles, roughly equivalent to a mere $50 gesture, to each family member. There was no mention of the humiliating behavior of the gate agent, nor any acknowledgement of the third-party intervention that had forced the truth into the light. "That's what they're calling it?" Deanna said flatly, her voice laced with bitterness. Publicly humiliating a black family is reduced to a misunderstanding and token compensation. They want to sweep it under the rug with corporate damage control. Marcus, peering over his father's shoulder, frowned in quiet indignation. Deanna's words resonated deeply with him, a confirmation of the injustice they had all experienced. "They're trying to minimize it, to make it disappear, as if our pain is just an unfortunate glitch in their system," she continued. "It's unacceptable, and we will not be silent." Before they could fully process the email, a commotion near the terminal entrance drew their attention. A group of airline staff had gathered, their voices hushed but urgent, as Keith, the supervisor from the Atlantic gate, stood at the center, speaking into his phone with a face that had turned pale with anxiety. Clarence recognized him instantly, and his heart sank as he remembered the cold, calculated way Keith had dismissed their rightful claim earlier that day. Diana, never one to back down, moved purposefully toward the group, with Clarence following closely behind, their steps measured but resolute. As they neared the cluster of staff, fragments of conversation reached their ears. "Social media, already viral," someone murmured. "It's becoming a PR nightmare." Keith ended his call abruptly and stepped forward, his professional mask barely concealing a growing alarm. "Dr. and Mrs. Holloway," he said in a measured tone, "I was hoping to speak with you." Diana's eyes narrowed as she replied coolly, "We received your email. It's a rather inadequate response to what happened at the gate, wouldn't you agree?" Keith glanced nervously at his colleagues before lowering his voice. "If we could speak privately for a moment," he suggested timidly. Deanna crossed her arms. "Anything you have to say can be said right here," she stated firmly, and Clarence added, "Let's step over there," pointing to a quieter area near a coffee kiosk. Once they were somewhat isolated, Keith's veneer finally cracked. His voice wavered as he began, "I want to personally apologize for what happened in Atlanta. There is no excuse for what you experienced." His apology, coming so late and so reluctantly, struck Clarence with a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. "You say it was just a computer error an hour ago, yet now you admit that a video of the incident is already viral on Twitter," Diana countered sharply. "How can you justify that this blatant act of discrimination was reduced to an error when it was witnessed by thousands?" Keith hesitated, his eyes darting around as if seeking escape. "It appears someone posted a video that has been shared over 20,000 times, he finally mumbled. His admission confirmed what they all knew deep down. Their humiliation was not an isolated incident, and corporate policies were designed to silence and pacify rather than to deliver justice. Clarence felt a renewed surge of anger, a righteous fury that had been simmering since the gate confrontation. He looked Keith in the eye, his voice low and resolute. "Keith, or whoever is responsible at Delta, your apology is not enough. We will expose this injustice in full, and we will make sure that every record, every statistic, and every witness is heard. The days of brushing aside blatant acts of racism for token gestures are over." Diana's eyes blazed with determination as she added, "Our experience today is not a mistake. It is a testament to the pervasive discrimination that still exists in our society, and we will not let it go unchallenged." As they returned to the crowded terminal, the weight of Keith's admission hung in the air like a dark cloud. Clarence's mind raced with plans of retribution, a public reckoning that would leave the airline's executives quaking and compel change throughout the industry. The injustice they had endured would become the catalyst for a campaign that would shine a light on every hidden bias and every ignored grievance. With each step they took toward the exit, the Holloway family carried with them not only the scars of humiliation, but also the seeds of a revolution that promised to transform their pain into power. In the days to come, As Clarence prepared for his critical presentation on neurological breakthroughs that could change countless lives, he knew that his fight was far from over. The airline's empty apology, the curt compensation offer, and the feeble attempt at damage control were not enough. They would rally support from every corner, through legal channels, social media, and community action, to ensure that no Black family would ever again be treated as if their dignity were expendable. This was not just about one incident. It was about dismantling a system built on centuries of prejudice and reclaiming the narrative for those who had long been silenced. For every 65-year-old woman who had witnessed decades of injustice and still believed in the promise of a better tomorrow, Dr. Clarence Holloway's struggle was a call to arms. It was a story of resilience, of transforming deep personal pain into a force that could topple entrenched systems of discrimination. And as the echoes of that fateful day in Atlanta reverberated through every fiber of his being, Clarence vowed that his response would be so overwhelming, so undeniably just, that it would leave the world exclaiming in awe and saying, "Now that is what I call retribution." Dr. Everett Carlisle sat in first class, his heart still pounding from the gate debacle as he pulled up the video on his phone. The footage was shockingly clear, captured by a passenger who had waited at the gate, and it laid bare every moment of the cruel exchange. The recording began with Marjorie questioning his boarding passes, her voice laced with condescension, and then showed Keith's feeble intervention, culminating in Mrs. Winchester's impassioned defense. The camera panned across the terminal, capturing the uneasy reactions of fellow passengers, some squirming in discomfort, while others nodded in silent agreement as Mrs. Winchester pointed out how computer errors disproportionately targeted passengers of color. For Dr. Carlisle, who had long endured such indignities, the video was a damning piece of evidence, transforming what had felt like a personal humiliation into a documented pattern of systemic racism in 2023. It ended with a stark text overlay proclaiming, "Watched this Black family with first-class tickets being told they had to fly economy due to computer error, until an elderly white woman stepped in." Keith's face turned grave as he put his phone away and admitted, "The company is concerned. This sort of publicity can be damaging, especially given our recent diversity initiatives." His rehearsed offer followed, a full refund of the tickets, an upgrade on their return flight if not already booked, and 25,000 miles for each family member, along with a formal apology from the regional director who wished to speak personally with them. But when young Marcus asked sharply, "What about Marjorie? What happens to her?" his tone was filled with a bitterness that cut deep. Keith stuttered, dismissing it as an internal personnel matter, a mere talking to, and perhaps some diversity training before she returned to inflict the same humiliation on the next Black family with first-class tickets. Marcus's cynicism resonated with the accumulated weight of countless small indignities he had witnessed. Diana's voice, precise and unyielding as ever, broke through the tension. "What we experienced today wasn't just poor customer service, Mr. Keith. It was discrimination, plain and simple." Her words, measured and resolute, reminded everyone that Marjorie had made assumptions based solely on their race, fabricating a computer error to push them back. When challenged, Keith had merely supported her claim without verifying the facts. Now, with public evidence in hand, the compensation on offer was nothing more than a bandage on a festering wound. "Money doesn't address the underlying issue. Your employees feel empowered to act on their biases without consequence," Diana declared. "I demand transparent action, a public acknowledgement of what happened, concrete changes to training and accountability systems, and appropriate consequences for those involved." Keith, both relieved and wary, promised to relay her suggestions to management and process the compensation immediately. After his brief apology, Diana turned to Clarence with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Are you thinking of taking this further legally?" she asked softly. He squeezed her hand and replied that he was considering using the leverage they now had to push for real change, though he was not planning to litigate unless forced. As they gathered their luggage and moved toward the exit, The weight of the incident and its implications still loomed large. Outside, the crisp San Francisco air mingled with the promise of their next steps. With their family united, Dr. Carlyle resolved that this episode would not only fuel his fight for justice, but also spark a movement that would demand accountability and ensure that no family would ever endure such indignity again. Dr. Franklin Monroe stepped into the bright California sunshine at the Fairmont with a deep, steadying breath, determined to compartmentalize the anguish of the morning's injustice and focus on the promise of the day ahead. "Welcome to the Fairmont, Dr. Monroe," the doorman greeted warmly, and although his tone was courteous, Franklin could not help but remember the venomous treatment he'd just endured at the gate. The Ellison family, now reimagined under his new name, had faced a disgraceful ordeal of blatant racism, a humiliating reminder that discrimination still festered even in the most modern of settings. Together with his resolute wife Diana and their perceptive son Marcus, he ascended the Grand Hotel steps, each step echoing with the quiet fury and dignity that had defined their struggle all morning. Inside, the following morning dawned clear and bright. Franklin, dressed impeccably in his charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, and that ever-lucky blue tie which had become a symbol of his triumph over adversity, stood by the hotel room window, admiring the sparkling bay. Behind him, Deanna emerged gracefully, her robe wrapping her like a comforting embrace, and she remarked softly, "Beautiful day." Her tone held an unspoken promise of support, even as Franklin's mind churned with thoughts of the viral video that had captured every humiliating moment at the gate. The footage, clear as day, documented Marjorie's sneering inquiry about their boarding passes, Keith's hesitant apology, and Mrs. Winchester's impassioned defense, a testament to the systemic racism that had nearly reduced them to silent victims. Franklin's heart ached at the company's feeble attempt to mend the wrongs with a refund and token miles, while Marcus's bitter remark about Marjorie echoed in his ears. The compensation, however, did nothing to erase the shame and anger. As the family gathered their luggage and made their way through the bustling terminal, Franklin's phone buzzed with messages and missed calls from Dr. Chen, the symposium chair. His upcoming keynote on neurodegenerative biomarkers was now overshadowed by the incident. Yet as he prepared to enter the Moscone Center, a storm of conflicting emotions roiled within him. Resentment at the injustice, determination to let his science speak for itself, and a fierce desire to reclaim his dignity. In the conference hall, as seats filled with supportive colleagues and young researchers, more diverse than ever, Franklin felt the weight of his responsibility. He listened intently as Dr. Chen updated him on the schedule change, noting that the incident had tripled interest in his session. Though media attention had thrust him into an unwanted spotlight, his mind was set on ensuring that his breakthrough research stood on its own merits. "I appreciate your support, but I want my work to be recognized for its scientific value, not as a footnote to a viral moment," he declared firmly. Yet even as he spoke those words, a part of him vowed that the time would come for a resounding response, a reckoning that would hold the perpetrators accountable and transform this bitter encounter into a clarion call for justice. Today, Dr. Franklin Monroe would present his research with the unyielding resilience of a man who refused to be defined by hate, determined that his legacy, and that of every oppressed soul, would be a beacon of hope and retribution. Dr. Franklin Monroe took his place at the podium with a mix of determination and lingering apprehension. The session on neurodegenerative research was drawing record attendance, so much so that the organizers had filled the room to capacity with a wait list, a fact that both thrilled and troubled him. On one hand, the overwhelming interest meant that his breakthrough work on early-onset Alzheimer's biomarkers would reach more lives, potentially sparking early interventions for thousands of patients. On the other, he couldn't help but suspect that many in the audience were more intrigued by the viral incident at the gate than by the science itself. "Are you ready?" Dr. Chen gently touched his arm as she prepared to introduce him. Franklin straightened his lucky blue tie, a symbol of perseverance amid adversity, and gave a nod. Dr. Chen's voice rang out. "Good morning, colleagues, and welcome to our keynote session on recent advances in neurodegenerative disease research." As she recounted his impressive list of publications and contributions, Franklin's mind drifted briefly to the incident that had made him an unwilling icon of systemic racism, a humiliating ordeal that had gone viral and sparked harsh commentary across social media. Yet now, as he stepped onto the stage, he was determined that his scientific achievements would shine brighter than any injustice he'd suffered. He began his talk with a simple, powerful declaration. Alzheimer's disease doesn't just steal memories. It steals identities, relationships, and futures. The room fell silent as his clear, resonant voice carried his message of loss and hope. He revealed the results of a 5-year longitudinal study, showing a novel biomarker constellation detectable up to 15 years before clinical symptoms manifested. Slide after slide, he wove a narrative of discovery, challenge, and breakthrough. A narrative that was entirely his own, unmarred by the stigma of the previous day's events. At one point, he paused and said, "I want to emphasize why inclusive research design is essential. When diagnostic tools are developed using homogeneous populations, they often fail those who fall outside that narrow group." His words resonated deeply, especially in light of the discrimination he had experienced. In that moment, the pain of the morning intermingled with the fervor of his scientific mission. He described how his team had deliberately included a demographically diverse cohort, ensuring that their findings applied universally. Colleagues in the audience nodded in understanding, and even Margaret Winchester, seated a few rows up, offered an encouraging smile. As the session progressed, the murmurs of genuine scientific inquiry grew into a vibrant discussion. A young researcher from the back raised a thoughtful question about making the biomarker tests accessible in resource-limited settings. Franklin welcomed the question, outlining plans for simplified testing protocols that could be used in primary care environments. His answer, meticulously detailed and driven by a passion for equity, sparked a ripple of applause and acknowledgement. When he concluded with a heartfelt, "Thank you for your attention, I welcome your questions," the hall erupted in applause. For those minutes on stage, Dr. Franklin Monroe was not just a victim of a cruel system, but a triumphant scientist whose groundbreaking work stood as a testament to resilience and the relentless pursuit of justice. His presentation, transcending personal pain, had now become a beacon of hope and a call to transform inequity into progress. Dr. Franklin Monroe paused in the quiet corner of the conference lounge, his phone pressed to his ear as he listened intently. On the other end, Thomas Wilson, Executive Vice President for Customer Experience at Delta Airlines, spoke with a measured sincerity that both surprised and unsettled him. "Dr. Monroe, thank you for taking my call," Wilson began, his tone formal yet unmistakably contrite. "I want to personally address the unacceptable incident you and your family experienced in Atlanta. There is no excuse for the treatment you received." Franklin felt a familiar knot tighten in his chest as he recalled the humiliation at the gate, the sneering interrogation by a gate agent who assumed his worth based solely on the color of his skin, and the dismissive tone of a supervisor who reduced his rightful first-class ticket to a clerical error. Wilson continued, "After reviewing the viral video which has now been seen by millions, our internal investigation has confirmed that there was no computer error. Your first-class tickets were valid, and the actions of our staff were a breach of our core values. As a result, we are taking significant measures. The employees involved have been placed on administrative leave, and we are auditing all similar cases from the past year to root out systemic bias." Franklin listened, his voice steady as he replied, "Thank you for your candor, Mr. Wilson. This is the first time I've heard a direct admission that what happened was not a mere error, but an act of discrimination." There was a pause before Wilson spoke again, his tone shifting to one of earnest resolve. "In addition to the disciplinary actions, we are implementing enhanced training programs focused on countering implicit bias. Moreover, we would like to offer you and your family full refunds for your tickets, complimentary first-class travel on your return flight, and 100,000 sky miles each as compensation. More importantly, we would welcome your input and your wife's expertise on how to strengthen our anti-discrimination policies. Franklin's mind raced. The offer was far more generous than the initial token gesture, yet he could sense the underlying tension of corporate damage control. He asked carefully, "What prompted this change in approach?" Wilson answered, "The overwhelming public reaction to the video forced us to re-examine our procedures. The incident, which was not an isolated service failure, but a reflection of deep-seated bias, demanded a response that goes beyond simple apologies. We want to ensure that no other family endures what you experienced." Franklin's heart swelled, with a mix of cautious hope and lingering resentment. He knew that while the words were promising, true change would require more than just compensation. It would demand a transformation in the very culture of the company. After a moment of thoughtful silence, Franklin said, "Mr. Wilson, I appreciate your willingness to address the underlying issues and your commitment to a thorough response. I will discuss your offer with my wife and consider how we might contribute to meaningful change." Wilson replied, "Please, take all the time you need. You can reach me directly at this number." As the call ended, Franklin felt the weight of the past 24 hours shift into a determined resolve. His professional journey, meant to save lives through groundbreaking research, had been marred by an act of racial injustice. Now, with a comprehensive proposal on the table, he vowed that the experience would not only be a catalyst for personal vindication, but also a turning point for corporate accountability in air travel. Dr. Franklin Monroe sat quietly in a secluded corner of the conference center, still processing the dramatic shift in Delta Airlines' response to the disgraceful treatment his family endured. The initial dismissal of the incident as a mere misunderstanding had given way to a frank admission of racial discrimination, complete with an offer for full refunds, complimentary first-class travel on the return journey, and a staggering 100,000 sky miles for each family member. Yet, despite the generous compensation, Franklin could not shake the bitter taste left by Marjorie's sneering inquiry and the systemic bias that had marred his journey. The cynic in him recognized that public exposure had forced this change, but he also knew that if these measures resulted in meaningful improvements for passengers of color, then the outcome might indeed be worth the struggle. As Franklin contemplated these developments, a determined woman approached him. It was Camille Rodriguez, the San Francisco Chronicle reporter he had spoken with earlier. Her presence exuded professionalism and an unwavering commitment to exposing inequities in elite spaces. "Dr. Monroe," she began, her tone both respectful and probing, "I'm here to explore how these patterns of discrimination persist in spaces that are meant to be meritocratic. What message do you want readers to take away from your experience?" Franklin, whose life had been defined by both groundbreaking research and the heavy burden of racial bias, paused to collect his thoughts. He explained that the double burden of not only facing overt discrimination but also having to carefully choose which battles to fight was a cruel reality for many. He described how every successful presentation was shadowed by the extra effort required to ensure that his expertise was acknowledged without becoming a token for diversity. Camille listened intently as he recounted the long hours spent preparing, the additional credentials he had been forced to display, and the mental calculations he made to avoid unnecessary confrontation, all while remaining a respected leader in neurology research. He emphasized that the incident was not isolated. It was symptomatic of a pervasive system that often judged Black professionals by preconceived notions rather than their true merit. "I want readers to understand that our struggle is not just about one viral moment," Franklin said firmly, "but about an ongoing fight against bias that forces us to work twice as hard for the same recognition." His voice, measured yet resolute, resonated with the audience he hoped to inspire, particularly those wise women who had seen decades of similar battles. After a robust discussion that lasted nearly 20 minutes, Camille thanked him for his candid insights and assured him that her piece would shine a light on these injustices without sensationalizing his personal ordeal. As she departed, Franklin checked his messages and noted a reminder to meet his family at the hotel around 5:30 p.m. He then joined his colleagues at the poster session in Exhibition Hall B, where his team's work on novel biomarkers was drawing deep, technical discussions from an engaged crowd. Even as he fielded questions about data visualization and longitudinal study design, the memory of Atlantis' humiliation remained a quiet fire within him. A reminder that every scientific breakthrough must be accompanied by a steadfast commitment to equity and justice. Dr. Franklin Monroe returned to the hotel lobby with a heavy yet determined heart, his mind still buzzing with the events of the day. As he stepped out of the exhibition hall, his phone vibrated insistently. A call from Deanna. He excused himself from the lingering crowd of researchers and found a quiet corner. "Hey," he answered softly, knowing his wife's voice would bring him a brief respite. "How's the Stanford tour going?" Diana's voice, warm with enthusiasm, came through. "It was excellent. The engineering department really impressed Marcus, although he's pretending not to care just to keep things interesting. He thinks we're all pushing him to become a doctor." Franklin chuckled, the sound bittersweet amid the chaos of his thoughts. "Let me guess, he's already plotting to rebel by studying something entirely different?" he teased, his tone light. Diana laughed in reply and then added, "By the way, Margaret Winchester invited us to dinner tonight at her son's place. I enjoyed our conversation on the plane, and I think it'll be nice to escape the hotel dining room for a while." Franklin agreed, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "I'll confirm with her shortly," he promised, before Diana mentioned that the airline had called her too. His voice grew immediately alert as Diana recounted the latest update from Thomas Wilson. Yes, he reiterated the offer: full refunds, complimentary first-class travel on the return, and even a consultation on their anti-discrimination policy review. "I told him we'd discuss it later tonight." Franklin straightened, his mind racing with mixed emotions. The company's response had evolved dramatically in less than 24 hours, morphing from a dismissive standard apology into a more robust acknowledgement of blatant racial bias. Yet even as he listened, the cynic in him couldn't help but suspect that these measures were driven primarily by public exposure and the threat of brand damage, rather than a genuine commitment to change. After ending the call, Franklin rejoined the flow of the conference crowd, thanking his research team for their unwavering support and excellent representation of their work. As the exhibition hall slowly emptied, he found himself alone with his thoughts, a rare, quiet moment to process the day's tumult. Outside, San Francisco greeted him with its characteristic cool breeze and a hint of ocean salt, offering an invigorating contrast to the stale tension of the conference center. He hailed a taxi and directed the driver with a calm authority, "Fairmont, please." As the taxi climbed the city's famous hills, his mind wandered between the professional triumph of his keynote presentation and the lingering sting of the discriminatory incident at Atlanta's airport. Franklin recalled every detail vividly: the way Marjorie Stevens had coldly questioned his family's boarding passes, dismissing their legitimate first-class status with an air of superiority. He remembered the subtle yet piercing biases that had marred each interaction at the gate, biases that had been captured on video and spread like wildfire, forcing the airline to scramble for damage control. Now, in the quiet solitude of the taxi, his thoughts shifted to the inevitable reckoning that lay ahead. Not just for him, but for every passenger of color who had ever been treated as less than they deserved. He considered the irony that while his groundbreaking research on early-onset Alzheimer's had the power to change lives, the very system designed to support his journey had tried to diminish him because of the color of his skin. In that moment, Franklin resolved that the injustice he'd experienced would not be allowed to define him. Instead, it would fuel a larger, more resounding call for accountability and transformation within the corporate world. His heart, though still heavy with the burden of representation, began to pulse with a cautious optimism, a belief that perhaps this viral incident, as painful as it was, might catalyze meaningful change. As the taxi pulled up to the elegant entrance of the Fairmont Hotel, Franklin's thoughts turned to the evening ahead. Dinner with Margaret Winchester promised not only good food and pleasant conversation, but also an opportunity to forge alliances with those who had shown kindness and insight when he needed it most. He remembered how Margaret, with her gracious intervention at the gate, had been a beacon of support amid the hostile environment. That evening, he resolved, would be a celebration not of his suffering, but of his strength, a moment to reclaim his dignity in the face of systemic injustice. Inside his hotel room, Franklin joined Diana and Marcus, who were already preparing for their evening outing. Their conversation flowed naturally, a mix of light-hearted banter about Marcus's Stanford tour and reflections on the day's challenges. Yet beneath the surface, the unresolved tension simmered, tension that Franklin knew would require a definitive response. He understood that the airline's newly issued compensation and policy review, while welcome, were merely the first steps toward rectifying a much deeper, more pervasive problem. Later that evening, over a sumptuous dinner at Margaret Winchester's son's home in Pacific Heights, the conversation turned from casual chatter to a more profound discussion about accountability. Margaret, ever the perceptive and forthright ally, shared stories of her own experiences navigating the corporate labyrinth of discrimination. She spoke of her late husband's legacy, a man who had treated every patient and colleague with unwavering respect, and urged Franklin to consider a course of action that would not only serve as retribution for his own humiliation, but as a clarion call for change across the industry. Franklin listened intently, his heart stirred by the collective weight of decades of racial bias and personal indignity. He began to outline a plan, not for revenge in the petty sense, but for a sweeping, transformative response that would force the airline and others like it to confront their deep-seated prejudices. "Imagine a public report," he said quietly, "one that doesn't just settle for apologies and token compensation, but demands transparent data collection on discriminatory practices, holds every implicated employee accountable, and restructures policies so that no family ever has to endure what we did." His voice, firm yet measured, resonated with the room, and even Marcus, sitting among the seasoned professionals, looked at his father with a new sense of pride and determination. As the dinner drew to a close, Franklin realized that his journey was far from over. The incidents of the day, the viral video, the executive phone call, and even the supportive yet critical insights of Camille Rodriguez from the Chronicle had merged into a single, overwhelming impetus for change. He knew that his research, which had once been solely about combating Alzheimer's, now carried an additional, urgent mandate: to advocate for equity in every sphere, from healthcare to air travel. Later, as Franklin returned to his hotel by taxi, the cool San Francisco air felt like a promise of renewal. He reflected on the parallel tracks of his day, the triumphant success of his keynote, and the painful reminder of systemic bias, and recognized that each step he took was part of a larger journey toward justice. Outside the taxi window, the city's vibrant energy mingled with the soft light of the setting sun, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of both past injustices and future hope. Back at the hotel, as he settled into the quiet comfort of his room, Franklin thought of Marjorie Stevens. In a modest suburban home far away, she now sat in silence, her career and reputation in tatters, as the public turned its gaze upon her. Her inability to justify her actions, those split-second decisions driven by a biased worldview, served as a stark counterpoint to the courage and integrity he had displayed throughout the day. Franklin knew that true retribution would not come from personal vendettas, but from the slow, relentless exposure of systemic wrongs and the collective action that would follow. For Franklin Monroe, the day had been a crucible, a test of his resilience as a scientist and as a black man striving for dignity in a world that too often judged him by the color of his skin rather than by his achievements. He vowed that the next steps would be taken not in quiet resignation, but in bold, public defiance of an outdated system. The virus of discrimination would be met with a cure brewed from accountability, transparency, and the unwavering support of allies both old and new. As the night deepened and the city outside hummed with quiet activity, Franklin felt a surge of hope. Though the journey ahead was fraught with challenges, tonight he was content to rest, knowing that his struggle, his voice, and his groundbreaking work would continue to resonate far beyond the confines of a single viral moment. And in that steadfast resolve lay the promise of a future where every person, regardless of their race, could step onto that first-class boarding gate with pride, free from the shadows of prejudice and empowered to soar toward their fullest potential.